Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Zahavi. I'm the director of the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen, and my topic today will be the phenomenological we. Now, the main questions I want to ask is whether considerations of the we perspective and we phenomena might put pressure on more standard accounts of minds, standard accounts that are more individualistic in nature. And I want to consider the question of whether we through social interaction might come to have experiences we couldn't otherwise have, whether shared experiences and shared emotions might involve some kind of fusion, might involve a breakdown of individual boundaries, or whether the we experience, the experience of being part or member of a we, might somehow presuppose or preserve the difference between self and other experiences. So that's the main focus of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to start with a consideration of the contribution by John Searle. In 1983, Searle published a very influential book on intentionality that basically highlighted the importance of the directedness of our consciousness. This was a very influential book. It kind of brought philosophy of mind into a new vein. But one of the characteristic things of that early treatment of Searle was that he primarily was focusing on the intentionality of individuals. There were no explicit consideration of more collective forms of intentionality. Now, 12 years later, in his book, The Social Construction of Reality, collective intentionality was much more in the focus. So it seems as if Searle in the intervening years really came to realize that a proper and exhaustive analysis of intentionality certainly had to consider it as well as a social phenomenon. Now, in his own treatment of collective or shared intentionality, Searle basically tries to reconcile a kind of anti-reductionism with a form of internalism. So, on the one hand, he claims that we intentions cannot be reduced to I intentions, but at the same time, he also insists that all mental states, including we intentions, are necessarily owned by and located inside the heads of individuals. And he even insists so much on this latter claim that he's willing to embrace the idea that an individual can we intend even if no other agent exists. And I think that is typically seen as a very explicit emphasis of the kind of die-hard internalism that Searle is defending. Now, in the course of his treatment of collective or social intentionality, at one point Searle raises a question that he doesn't really explore in much detail, which is the question of whether collective intentionality presupposes any background capacities. And some of the very brief answers he gives is that a biological primitive sense of the other person as a candidate for shared intentionality is a presupposition. And as he puts it slightly later in the text, in order to have collective intentions, one must suppose that, and I quote, others are agent like yourself, that they have a similar awareness of you as an agent like themselves, and that these awarenesses coalesce into a sense of us as possible or actual collective agents. Now, I don't think that Searle really explores this idea in any detail, but that is to some extent the going to be a line of thinking that I want to explore further in my lecture today. And in order to get to that, I want to say one more thing about Searle, because in the beginning of the construction of social reality, in the very introduction, Searle briefly comments about the prehistory of this investigation of shared or collective intentionality. And he basically argues or claims that the the great philosophers, sociologists from the beginning of the 20th century, including Simmel and Weber and Durkheim, basically didn't have the resources to really tackle the issue of we-intentionality. And the reason why they didn't have those resources was because they basically didn't have a proper account of intentionality. And that is, of course, what Searle himself thinks that he has available. Now, one interesting and I think rather revealing lacuna in Searle's dismissal of the prehistory is the fact that he fails to mention the contribution of Alfred Schütz. Now, Schütz's most important work, Der sinnhafte Aufbau der sozialen Welt, has a rather striking similarity to the title of Searle's own contribution, The Construction of Social Reality. And that's not the only similarity. Basically, what Schütz offers us is a very detailed investigation, not just of collective intentionality, but also of individual intentionality. In fact, that was part of what Schütz was complaining that Weber had missed out in his establishment of sociology as a scientific discipline. And of course, Schütz himself is a member of or a proponent of phenomenology. And if one looks at the phenomenological tradition, including contributions by people like Husserl and Stein and Walzer, Heidegger, and so on, what one will find in that tradition is precisely a very targeted investigation of intentionality, of meaning, and an investigation of collective or shared intentionality. And it's rather striking that one can actually find a very similar movement that we just saw exemplified in Searle's work as well, because in the kind of breakthrough work, that's the label that Husserl uses in describing his logical investigations from 1900-1901. In this breakthrough work to phenomenology, Husserl offers a very detailed investigation of intentionality, but there's a very little reference to intersubjectivity, sociality, and shared forms of intentionality. But if one then looks about 15 years later, roughly starting from the middle of World War I, one will come across a whole series of important monographs, articles, book chapters that all focus on issues related to collective and shared intentionality. So it's basically like 80 years before Searle made this move to collective intentionality, the very same move had been made by a number of the phenomenologists. And what the phenomenologists are also doing, and I think this again reflects or mirrors a move made by Searle, is that they also argue that in order to understand shared intentionality, what we really need to look at is the way in which individuals are experientially interrelated and to what extent collective intentionality is based on various forms of interpersonal understanding and reciprocal recognition. So here on the current slide, you can see some of the central figures in phenomenology, and in this accompanying slide, I have listed some of the crucial years and some of the main publications found in that tradition. And so the figures, I mean, phenomenology, of course, is a very expansive and multifaceted philosophical tradition. So there's no way that I can kind of do justice to all the contributions in that tradition to the issue that we are currently focusing on today. But I want to primarily address and comment on the contributions by Husserl, Scheler, Stein, Walzer, and Schütz in the following. So again, my way of understanding the topic, the phenomenological we, is really in terms of how was the we discussed and analyzed by the classical phenomenologists. That's basically the way I'm going to approach this topic. So in order to get to this, we basically need to to take a few steps backwards, and we need to start with a brief consideration of the topic of empathy. Now, empathy is not a very old concept. It's actually a rather new concept. It was originally used and introduced by people working on aesthetics towards the end of the 19th century. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, Theodor Lipps took up the concept and for the first time used it in the context of social cognition. And so for Lipps, empathy was the label for our understanding of other minds. And he basically proposed that the mechanism underlying empathy is a form of inner imitation. And that's very much an idea that has been picked up subsequently, and it can be found in current discussions. I mean, that very idea can be found defended by people belonging to a so-called simulationist approach to social cognition. Now, Lipps is not really himself part of the phenomenological tradition, but many of the phenomenologists were very quick to pick up on the concept of empathy after Lipps had used it in the social cognition debate. They also used it to designate a kind of basic understanding of others, but they all rejected Lipps's more specific proposal, namely that empathy has to be accounted for in terms of a kind of inner imitation. So on their account, empathy is not a question of somehow having the other's experience or mental state being. It's not a question of imitating the other's experience or mental state. It's not a question of having the other's mental state somehow infect the empathizer. Rather, they all insist that there's a clear difference between having an experience oneself and coming to understand that somebody else is having a specific experience. So on their account, empathy has nothing to do with imitation. Rather, it is really a label for or a specific epistemic achievement, namely coming to understand the mental states or the psychological life of others. And one way to exemplify what I think is really the distinctive phenomenological take on empathy, and this is really also a take that is rather different from many of the contemporary uses of the term empathy, is basically to compare the discussion of empathy with a kind of basic distinction that one finds in Husserl's initial discussion of intentionality. Because according to Husserl, it's possible to intend a specific object in a number of different ways. And so I might, for instance, think about in a rather vague manner about the Tower of Pisa. So my thought is about the Tower of Pisa, but not in any kind of fleshed out manner. Then compare that to a situation where I'm imagining the Tower of Pisa and I'm really trying in all kinds of details to again imagine, you know, the exact features of the tower in many details, and then compare that again to a situation where I'm actually standing in front of the Tower of Pisa and perceiving it directly. So according to Husserl, these are three distinct ways of intending the same object, and Husserl also argued that perception has a certain privilege because it kind of presents us with the intended object in a kind of direct and privileged manner. Now, if we then move into the social cognition debate, the phenomenologists would basically argue that it's also possible to come to understand the experiences of others in a variety of different ways. And so I might think about or refer to Anne's anger. So my thought is really about Anne's anger, about her mental state. I can also imagine Anne's anger. I can kind of try to put myself in her shoes, try to simulate or imitate her situation, thereby trying to kind of flesh out her emotional state. But finally, I can also basically witness and perceive or intuit Anne's anger if I'm spatially and temporally in proximity with her. So in a face-to-face situation, I can see Anne's anger. I can see how angry she is. It's not a question of me imagining it, nor is it merely a question of me thinking about it. And that latter possibility, me intuiting Anne's anger, is what the phenomenologists would typically refer to in terms of empathy. So for them, to empathically understand Anne's anger is really a question of being presented with her anger in the here and now. Now, the question is then, what does that have to do with shared emotions or collective emotions or shared experiences? And as I mentioned earlier, all the phenomenologists are kind of rejecting the idea that empathy is a question of imitation. So they would also, for the very same reason, argue that empathy doesn't have anything to do with sharing proper. And one way, I think, to understand that rejection or that denial is by considering the following scenario. I might empathically grasp that my friend loves his wife. Now, it would be a bit weird, I guess, to argue that in order for me to empathically understand that my friend loves his wife, I need to share his love for his wife. I mean, that seems to be a slightly strange requirement. So that could be a kind of initial reason for rejecting the idea that empathy involves sharing. Likewise, I might empathically understand that my son is afraid of the boogeyman. Now again, in order for me to empathically grasp his fear, it seems strange to argue that I also need to be afraid of the boogeyman. So again, these are very kind of commonsensical examples to put pressure on the idea that empathy involves sharing. But here's an even more important idea that one can also find in the phenomenological literature. Empathy can easily be one-sided. I can empathize with somebody even if the person in question is completely unaware of the fact that I'm empathizing with him or her. So empathy can be one-sided. The question is whether it makes any sense to talk of sharing as being one-sided, or whether sharing doesn't necessarily involve some kind of reciprocity, some kind of mutuality. And I think that recent work on joint attention might kind of give support to that idea, because in order to have joint or shared attention, it's not really enough that the two persons are simply focusing on the same object, nor is it enough if one person is attending to the other person's target of attention. Now, what is required in order to have real joint or shared intention is that the fact that both of these people are aware of attending together, that is, the fact that both are attending to the same object, must be mutually manifest. And I think that idea, the idea that in order to have sharing proper, we need some kind of mutuality, we need some kind of reciprocity, is an idea, I think, that can be which is articulated further in the phenomenological discussion of shared experiences and we experiences. And so, just to take one terminological idea that can be found in the work of Max Scheler. So Max Scheler makes it pretty clear that in order to understand the issue of sharing, we shouldn't really look at Einfühlung or Einfühlen, which is the German term for empathy. No, we have to look at what Scheler calls Mitfühlen or Miteinanderfühlen, which is precisely the domain of shared or collective emotions. So the idea here is, again, in order to understand sharing, sharing is not one-sided. Sharing doesn't really have anything to do with empathy. Rather, sharing has to do with collective emotions or we emotions. And let me try to develop this proposal a bit further. Now, let's take a again simple example of a shared emotion. So imagine a situation where people are sitting in a cinema and enjoying a movie. And so one might say, we enjoyed the movie, thereby using the first person plural to articulate the experience in question. Now, how should we understand this use of the first person plural, of the we? Is it simply a question of me enjoying a movie and plus you enjoying the movie? Is that the right way to understand the use of the first person plural? I mean, that would be a kind of aggregative reading. So the reason why we are using the first person plural is really just to highlight the fact that both of us are intending the same object. Now, that is a perfectly respectable way of using the first person plural, but it's not really, I think, the interesting way of using it, because there's another use of the first person plural which says something over and above that we are just attending to the same object. And what might be added here is the idea that we are attending to the same object, we are enjoying the movie together. It's the togetherness that is important in this use of the first person plural. So another way of exemplifying this idea would be to say that if I'm having an experience that it makes sense for me to articulate by using the first person plural, that experience is not one I could have had on my own. It's an experience I can only have because I'm having it together with somebody else. So the experience is not simply given as mine, it's given as ours. So again, what motivates the use of the first person plural here is the fact that the experience is given as ours. And that, of course, is a very different, much richer understanding of what the first person plural refers to than the aggregative reading that I just mentioned a second ago. So again, what we find here is that emotional sharing or experiential sharing, there's something unsatisfactory with simply opting for a reductionist or summative reading where all it means is that I enjoyed the movie and you enjoyed the movie, and then on top of that perhaps we had some kind of knowledge about the fact that the other was also enjoying the movie. I think this idea that one can account for shared emotions simply in terms of an individual experience or a number of individual experiences plus reciprocal knowledge seems to miss out on what is really decisive. It misses out on the crucial togetherness. It misses out on the fact that the experience I'm having is not just an individual experience. It's not just an experience I could have had also if I had been alone. Rather, it's an experience that I can only have precisely because I'm having it together with you. So I think there are reasons to reject a summative or aggregative account of re-intentionality. But of course, that still leaves it open how then we should understand it. And here we need to consider some different options that can be found in phenomenology, because not all phenomenologists are in agreement. Let me first consider a proposal that can be found in the work of Merleau-Ponty, and which has recently been picked up by contemporary participants in the discussion. So in Merleau-Ponty's Sorbonne lectures on child psychology, lectures from 48, Merleau-Ponty at one point makes the suggestion that if we are to make social cognition comprehensible, if we are to understand how we might come to understand others, it could be that we need to posit an initial state of undifferentiation. and claimed that the beginning of psychogenesis is one where the child is not yet aware of itself and other as different beings. So the basic idea is that if we kind of posit an undifferentiated ground out of which the difference between self and other emerge, then we might avoid or bypass certain metaphysical and epistemological problems. And that idea has then been recently taken up by Joel Kruger, who have argued that if we look at developmental psychology, there's much to support the idea that that infant and caregiver, that the way they are interacting might basically exemplify what one might call a coupled social system. Meaning what? Well, meaning that there is a certain constitutive interdependence, a certain co-regulation going on between the experience of the infant and the caretaker. In fact, the idea would be that processes in the caretaker are actually part of kind of responsible for the realization of the infant's emotion. So were it not for processes going on in the caretaker, in the adult, it wouldn't be possible for the infant to have the kind of experience that the infant is in fact having. And Kruger even makes the case that if we are faced with kind of tight coupling in such a system, there is a certain, we're actually encountering a kind of phenomenal undifferentiation, and he even proposes that we in such cases might be faced with a numerical single experience being shared by two different subjects. And that's why he occasionally talks about jointly owned, a jointly owned intention. So again, on his account, in the infant caretaker case, there is just one emotion which is then shared by several individuals. One token emotion. Now that idea has also been pursued, or somewhat similar idea has also been pursued by Hans Bernhard Schmidt. But rather than taking his point of departure in the work of Merleau-Ponty, Schmidt takes his inspiration from the work of Mark Scheler. And let me just read the central quote aloud. The father and the mother stand beside the dead body of a beloved child. They feel in common the same sorrow, the same anguish. It's not that A feels this sorrow and B feels it also, and moreover that they both know they are feeling it. No, it's a feeling in common. The sorrow as value content and the grief as characterizing the functional relation thereto are here one and identical. Now, it's a little bit controversial exactly how one should interpret Scheler, but according to Schmidt, he basically pushes the following interpretation. If we're talking about the sharing of emotions, we should go for a completely straightforward interpretation. So just as when we are talking about sharing a bottle of wine, it's one and the same bottle of wine we are sharing. It's not as if I have my token wine bottle and you have your token wine bottle. It's the very same token that we are sharing. Similarly, if we're sharing a toothbrush or a taxi ride or an apartment, it's the very same token that we are sharing. Schmidt would argue that we also have to opt for that kind of interpretation when we are talking about shared emotions. And so here's another quote from Schmidt himself, where he says, "There is a sense in which it's literally true that when a group of people has an emotion, there's one feeling episode, one phenomenal experience in which many agents participate. Group emotions are shared feelings. Shared feelings involve some phenomenological fusion. They are shared in the strong, straightforward sense in which there is one token affective state in which many individuals take part." So this is again, I think, significant proposal. It's a proposal that to some extent can be supported by central texts in the phenomenological tradition. But I also think there are some problems with that specific take, and it's also problems that have been highlighted by certain other figures in the phenomenological tradition. So what might be the problems? Well, I think it's important at first to make it clear what precisely we mean by sharing the very same emotion. Now, what is meant by this is not merely the fact that the emotions of two different people can target the very same object. I mean, that's completely uncontroversial, so that's not the issue. The claim has to be that it's the very subjective state that is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. It's not just as if it's not just similar in kind, it's the very same state that I have and that you have. But I think there are good reasons to argue that even if constitutive interdependence and emotional co-regulation might be crucial for emotional sharing, they don't constitute emotional sharing, because you can have emotional co-regulation and constitutive interdependence without sharing an emotion. And let me give you an example that can exemplify this. Consider the case of a sadistic rapist and a terrified victim. So the enjoyment of the rapist feeds off the terror of the victim, and the victim's terror feeds off the enjoyment of the rapist. So the enjoyment of the rapist and the fear of the victim are indeed co-regulated, and they are also constitutively interdependent in the sense that the rapist couldn't have the enjoyment he had were it not for the terror of the victim, and vice versa. So I think we here have a case where we have constitutive interdependence, we have emotional co-regulation, but I think it's pretty obvious that we are not talking about a shared emotion. It's not as if the rapist and the victim are having exactly the same emotional state. Likewise, with an infant and an adult, I mean, what we shouldn't ignore here is what we might call the historicity of our experiential life. That is the idea that what we experience is in all kinds of ways influenced by what went before. So my past experiences are in different ways enabling, shaping, constraining, and also limiting the kinds of experience I am currently capable of having. And to suggest that in a situation where the infant and the caretaker are tightly coupled, that we should then encounter one single experience would of course amount to the claim that the adult would suddenly be reduced to some kind of infantile state of mind. So it would be as if the history of the adult would suddenly be wiped away and the adult would be a blank slate. I think that's incredibly implausible. So I think there's simply a problem about equating co-regulation and constitutive interdependence with one and the same token emotion. And I think that that point has been made, as I mentioned, by some of the classical phenomenologists. And here's a quote by Schütz, from Schütz's main work, where Schütz is basically saying as follows. The postulate, therefore, that I can observe the subjective experience of another person precisely as he does is absurd, for it presupposes that I myself have lived through all the conscious states and intentional acts wherein this experience has been constituted. In short, my stream of consciousness would have to coincide with the other person's, which is the same as saying that I should have to be the other person. So basically, on Schütz's account, the only way that one could come to have exactly the same experience as somebody else would basically be if one were exactly like the other. In all details, one would have to have exactly the same prehistory, exactly the same past, which would basically amount to being completely identical with the other person. And so one could say that were that really a requirement for sharing? That is, would it only, if it only made sense to talk of shared emotions if we were dealing with a token identical emotion that was shared between two different subjects? It would be extremely rare that something like that would happen, and ultimately one could question whether it would even make sense. And so I think that kind of leaves us with two options. I mean, either we give up on the idea of ever coming across shared emotions, or we opt for an alternative account. And I think we should do the latter. So let's consider a slightly different possibility, which is actually one that Hans Bernhard Schmidt has argued for, because although he argues that shared emotions do involve token identity, he also argues that we need to respect what he calls the difference condition. Now, what does that mean? Well, it basically means that different individuals can be said to share the very same token state, although what they actually feel is different. And so the example given by Schmidt is the case of a composer, of a group of musicians, and of an audience after a well-performed concert. Here it might make sense to say that the composer, the musicians, and the audience shared joy after the well-performed performance. So there is a shared emotion, a shared feeling of joy. But on Schmidt's account, we can talk about this shared joy, although what the composer feels, what the musicians feel, and what the members of the audience feel actually differ somewhat in intensity and quality of character. So the idea is basically that one and the same emotion can be shared while still being experienced in different ways. And Schmidt is then, of course, it's very important for him to insist that this difference doesn't amount to a plurality of different experiences. There's only one experience, but it's rather that there is a variety or plurality of different aspects or parts of the very same experience. And what could one say vis-a-vis such a proposal? Well, I think it's obvious that Schütz's criticism would no longer be relevant, because again, the idea here is that actually people might experience slightly different things, although they are still having the very same emotion. Now, I think it's I still have some problems with that specific proposal, and here's why. I think we need to recall that an emotion is not an object. An emotion is an experience. So I already said it's uncontroversial that two different emotions, two different experiences can target one and the same object. That's not up for grasp. I mean, that's pretty obvious. The controversial question is whether one and the same emotion can be whether two different individuals or more individuals can share one and the same emotion. And the point now is to remember an emotion is an experience. And to claim that an emotion can be experienced differently by different individuals, what does that then mean? Well, presumably it means that one and the same experience can be experienced differently by different individuals. But to talk in such a way seems to introduce a distinction between the experience and the way in which it is experienced that is basically taken over from the distinction between an object and the way in which it is experienced. And the question is whether it's a good idea to introduce such an object-act division within the experience itself. Does it really make sense to say that my experience of my experience involves an act-object structure? I think there are many reasons for avoiding that proposal. I don't have time on this occasion to kind of engage in a more extensive discussion of self-consciousness, which I think is a topic that has direct relevance for this question. But I just think it's a very odd position to end up in. I have difficulty seeing how Schmidt's proposal can avoid ending there. So that's, I think, basically my reason for proposing that we should continue looking for alternatives if we want to see, or if we want to come up with a kind of coherent and plausible account of what emotional sharing might actually amount to. So again, just to recap, before moving on to the final part of my talk, I think we need to recognize, and I think Schmidt's point was important here, and I think we need to recognize that different individuals can be said to share emotions, although what they actually experience differ somewhat. And so I think that's correct. I think it's a mistake to argue that we can only have or share an emotion if we experience exactly the same thing. So I think we need to recognize and respect difference. And the reason why we might be said to share an emotion despite this difference certainly has to do with some kind of overarching unity. I also think it's important to maintain the idea that what individuals feel or experience when they do it together with others isn't independent of the relation that they are standing in to others. So it wouldn't be the kind of experience they would be able to have had they been simply on their own. And finally, I also think that it's important to remember this reference to, it's important to recall something I mentioned earlier, namely the idea that in order to, that in the case of a shared emotion, the emotion in question isn't simply given as mine, but as ours. So one way to kind of use a slightly technical locution to capture this is by saying that the what it's likeness of shared emotions is a what it's like for us. I also think that's a very important idea. So let's try to see if we can preserve these three ideas without kind of starting to embrace the idea that what we need to opt for is a token identity view. Now, so far I've basically been referring to Scheler and Merleau-Ponty. So Kruger was influenced or inspired by Merleau-Ponty, Schmidt by Scheler. But let's take now a look at another group of phenomenologists who I think jointly are kind of can be seen to articulate a slightly different view on what exactly shared experiences and we experiences might amount to. So here's a reference to Edith Stein. Now, her dissertation was written during the First World War, and I mean, one of the examples she gives is the kind of emotion one might feel when reading in the newspaper that a certain fortress is fallen. And she says, we were then all seized by the same joy. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that the boundaries or borders between individuals have suddenly broken down and we have all fused and become one big subject? Now, Stein rejects that proposal. What she instead suggests is that the shared emotion arises out of the following elements. I mean, she doesn't really offer us a very detailed account, but these are part of the kind of building blocks she's using. So she's saying, I'm experiencing joy after having been informed about this event. And at the same time, I also empathically grasp that you are feeling joy, and vice versa. You are feeling joy, you are feeling your own joy, and you're also empathically grasping that I'm feeling joy. So what is really happening here is that our respective joys overlap or coincide, and as a result, I might come to feel your joy as mine, and you might come to feel my joy as yours. So at that point, what we come to feel when we are sharing this joy is certainly different from what we were to feel, what we could feel were we just alone. I mean, empathy, although not amounting to sharing, is a crucial element in order to establish sharing. And Stein also insists that in order to have this shared joy, in order to come to experience the joy as ours, there's no breakdown of the self-other difference. Rather, the I and the you are retained in the we. Now, a few years after this text by Stein, where we find these considerations, Gerda Walter defended a regrettably not very well-known dissertation entitled Zoantologie der sozialen Gemeinschaften, which really offers an extremely detailed and I think very sophisticated account of communal experiences, we experiences, shared experiences. And so part of the argument that we find in Walter is that on the one hand, an insistence on the fact that empathy does not amount to sharing. Because if I empathically grasp that somebody else is grieving or afraid or enjoying themselves, that doesn't amount to having a shared emotions, because the psychological state that I'm empathically grasping remains the states of the target of my empathy. They remains the emotions of the other. They don't become my emotions simply because I'm empathically understanding or grasping that the other is living through those states. So empathy is not sufficient for emotional sharing. Walter also argues, and this kind of is a bit in line with the kind of argument I presented a moment ago. She also argues that interaction and co-regulation is not sufficient for sharing. And the argument, the example she provides is basically a case where two people are in turn insulting each other. So here we are certainly dealing with interaction. We're also dealing with emotions that might be co-regulated. I mean, we might in turn become more and more enraged. But that would not, of course, amount to an experience of being a we. It wouldn't amount to having a kind of a shared perspective. So what more is needed on top of co-regulation and constitutive interdependence? And the proposal by Walter is that what is missing in this case, and in the case of the people who are insulting each other, or the case of the rapist and the victim, is a Gefühl der Zusammengehörigkeit. Some kind of identification with or feeling or sense of togetherness. If that is in place, well, then the experience of the other comes to be felt as mine and vice versa, and the shared experience comes to be given as ours. I think this reference to a Gefühl der Zusammengehörigkeit, I think that's very informative, but it still leaves it an open question exactly how it's established or brought about. And I think one can find some further suggestions in the work of Schütz and Husserl. Schütz argues that the we relationship comes about as a result of a reciprocal thou orientation. So he is very much focusing on the issue of reciprocity. To have a we relationship, it's not enough that I'm kind of thou oriented or that I'm empathizing. What we need is a reciprocal relationship that involves both parties. If that happens, we come to live in our, as he puts it, in our common stream of consciousness. Now that doesn't involve a reference to fusion. What he's referring to is a certain interlocking of the streams of consciousness. He also talks about our respective experiences being colored by our mutual involvement. So again, I think the important idea in Schütz is the idea of reciprocity. And a final idea can be found in Husserl, who distinguishes between empathy which can be one-sided, and communicative acts which are necessarily reciprocal. And Husserl argues that it's when the other reciprocates, and it's when both of us become aware that we are understood by the other, that something like a we might emerge. So, what is really at stake in Husserl's account is actually an accentuation of the importance of coming to realize not just that one is understanding somebody else, but that somebody else is experiencing and attending to and understanding oneself. It's really a question also of coming to adopt or experience the perspective of the other on oneself. And Husserl claims that in order to have an experience of a we, in order to experience oneself as part of a we need that perspective shift. And let me just give you two quotes from Schütz and Husserl respectively that just exemplifies the ideas I've just mentioned. So first a quote by Schütz. I take up an other orientation toward my partner, who's in turn oriented toward me. Immediately and at the same time, I grasp the fact that he, on his part, is aware of my attention to him. In such cases, I, you, we live in the social relationship itself. The social relationship in which we live is constituted therefore by means of the attentional modification undergone by my other orientation, as I immediately and directly grasped within the latter the very living reality of the partner as one who is in turn oriented toward me. So this was Schütz, and here's a quote by Husserl. In my own case, I arrive at the apprehension of man by way of a comprehension of others. That is, insofar as I comprehend them as centers not only for the rest of the surrounding world, but also for my body, which is for them an object of the surrounding world. It is precisely thereby that I comprehend them as apprehending me, similar to the way I apprehend them, thus as apprehending me as a social man. The comprehensive representation others have or can have of me is of service to me as regards the apprehension of myself as a social man, hence the apprehension of myself totally different from the way I grasp myself in direct inspection. By means of this apprehension with its complicated structure, I fit myself into the family of man, or rather, I create the constitutive possibility for the unity of this family. It's only now that I am, in the proper sense, an ego over against an other, and can then say we. And so I think it's admittedly a rather complicated quote, but the central idea is that Husserl argues that in order for me to come to experience myself as part of a we, I need to come to experience myself as attended to or addressed by the other. And I kind of need to take over this kind of mediated self-experience. Now, one objection that might be raised against this idea is that it's too complicated, too cognitively sophisticated. I mean, if it really involves perspective taking, wouldn't it mean that, say, children would have to be relatively mature before they could come to have shared emotions? And might that not be, an objection? But I think there are reasons not to be too worried, because a number of developmental psychologists, I think, are precisely pointing to kind of primitive or early forms of perspective taking that they see exemplified from very early on, say around 6 months of age, and which for them are crucial in order to understand something like shared emotions. So here are just a few references. I mean, Rochat talks about how face-to-face interactions already from 6 to 8 weeks and up allow for certain dyadic exchanges and emotional sharings. And Hobson has introduced a notion of identifying with, which he defines as the capacity to assimilate the other's orientation towards self, such that this orientation becomes part of a feature of one's own psychological repertoire. And he claims that can already be found in kind of primitive forms in young infants' affective engagement with others. So I think if one were to kind of embrace this idea that the phenomenologists are pushing, it wouldn't necessarily entail that it would be something that would only arise or emerge at a relatively late stage of development. Early forms could already be found early in development. Now, I'm coming quickly to a close now. Let me just highlight a few more distinctions that I think can be found in the phenomenological discussion of we intentionality. So one important consideration is the difference between a dyadic you-me relationship and a triadic you-me world relationship. Some people have argued that too much focus on the other, too much focus on reciprocal forth and back might actually undermine shared intentions or we intentions. And I think one way to illustrate that might precisely be by taking up the example of the sharing a movie together. I mean, if we are paying too much attention to each other, we are not really sharing the movie. So there's some kind of balance that has to go on here. The question, though, is whether one should then insist that ultimately we don't need to pay attention, we don't need to be aware of the other at all, or whether one might rather say that it's possible to remain aware of the other in a more peripheral manner, in a more marginal manner, while attending to the shared object. And I mean, that would probably be my own way of kind of finding the right balance. So I don't think we can do away with a reference to the other, but of course we also need to remember that shared intentions and shared emotions in most cases are triadic and do involve kind of a worldly topic. That's one comment. Another issue that also needs to be highlighted is the fact that there are many different types of we. Now, I have primarily been focusing on face-to-face based we. I think that's the most fundamental form of we, and I think that's an idea that people like Schütz and Husserl and Walter would also claim. But of course, we shouldn't make the mistake of just limiting the we to those forms of we experience, because those forms of we experience are very much tied to the here and now. They are very ephemeral. And of course, we need to recognize that there are far more impersonal and anonymous and linguistically mediated forms of we intentionality. And so it makes perfect sense for me to say that I can have an experience as, say, a Danish citizen and can come to have certain experiences because of my identification with a certain group, although I'm de facto not physically together with anybody else. And so any account of the we must also be able to account for those kinds of, again, more anonymous, institutionalized forms of we intentionality. I think Tomasello has recently made a similar distinction by arguing that shared intentionality can be divided into joint intentionality, which is dyadic, and collective intentionality, which is much more group-based and anonymous. And I think, again, there are resources in phenomenology to explore this line of reasoning further. But to quickly sum up and conclude, on one proposal, and I think, and again, this is somewhat debatable, but there are at least people who would interpret Scheele and Merleau-Ponty and also Heidegger, whom I have not had time to discuss in detail, who would interpret them along these lines. The argument would be that the sharing of emotions does not presuppose the givenness of the other experiencer, does not presuppose empathy, but precedes any such other awareness, precedes any such givenness. And along similar lines, one might also say that the we is not based upon other experience, does not involve or presuppose any kind of reciprocal I-thou relationship, and that which is shared somehow precedes the distinction between yours and mine and is prior to any form of intersubjectivity. So that might be one kind of a trend in the phenomenological discussion. Now, a different phenomenological discussion or a different phenomenological take basically suggests that paradigmatic cases of we experience do presuppose direct face-to-face based forms of other awareness, and that they involve, without being reducible to, constitutively interdependent experiences and a certain form of second-person perspective taking, where I come to be aware not just of you, but also come to be aware of me being attended to or targeted or addressed by you. And so the idea here would be that if we are to understand the first person plural, we might actually have to go through an investigation of the second person singular. So on that account, the self-other differentiation really is retained in and precedes the emergence of the we. So these are two different takes on the we that can be found in phenomenology. What I think should be concluded is that discussions of the we, discussions in social ontology about collective intentionality, shared intentionality, I think they can profit in all kinds of ways from resources found in debates on social cognition and in discussions found in philosophy of mind. And I think there are good reasons to argue that considerations of we phenomena, considerations of emotional sharing, might force us to reject overly solipsistic and disembodied accounts of mind and self, simply because such disembodied solipsistic accounts of mind and self are not able to do justice to genuine we phenomena. But having said that, I also think it would be a mistake to claim that the only way to do justice to the we is by completely rejecting any notion of we and self and you and other, because such notions supposedly are somehow trapped within a certain Cartesian framework. On my take, and I think that would be precisely the intuition of many phenomenologists, the only reason to think that one ought to reject the notion of subject and self and an I and other in order to get to proper we phenomena would precisely be if one's understanding of subject and self and other were too Cartesian. So I think a proper understanding of the self and the other and of subjectivity will show us that they are perfectly compatible with and amenable to a full and rich account of collective intentionality, shared emotions, and the we perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.